Welcome to Moral Agency Part 2. This time it's ethical. Now, this talk is a direct follow-up to the presentation I gave on Zeitgeist Day, and so if you haven't seen that yet, I strongly recommend that you start there. Links will be provided in the video description. So, jumping right in, Part 3, False Moral Authority. Capitalism derives its moral authority from a concept called reciprocity. Now, reciprocity is essentially a fancy way of saying give and take. I give you something in exchange for what you give me. In a scarcity-driven model, this kind of exchange makes all kinds of sense. You have to think back to the days of pre-industrial society. In that time, it took much more time and energy to perform any task than it does today. Why? Because we have access to technology that they lacked. As a result, specialization of labor was crucial. If you grew corn for a living, that task would take up much of your time. You'd still need other commodities, clothes, shoes, furniture. However, many of these goods required specialized skills that you would not have time to learn, skills like carpentry or blacksmithing. That being the case, the ideal solution is to trade one good for another, corn for horseshoes. However, a problem arises when you try to determine how many bushels of corn are worth how many horseshoes. And this is an inherently subjective problem, so a standard was necessary. Money was invented to create a fixed price for each good. So instead of trying to trade horseshoes for corn, you would sell the corn at a fixed price, then use that money to buy horseshoes. In theory, this was all fair and equitable, but this system is predicated on two fundamental assumptions. Number one, that you will only make money by providing goods and services that people actually need. Number two, that all forms of productive labor will be fairly compensated with money. Perhaps this was indeed the case in the days of Adam Smith. However, today, it is most certainly not. The reality is quite the opposite. It is quite possible to make enormous sums of money by committing socially harmful behavior. And sometimes the people who create the most beneficial goods and services are never compensated for their work. Let's take a look at a few examples. What you're looking at is the tobacco atlas for the World Lung Foundation, and it estimates that the U.S. tobacco companies make roughly $35 billion a year. $35 billion, with a B, for selling us poison. Now, at this point, a libertarian typically interjects, but Rich, is that really such a bad thing? And people have free will, right? If people want to buy cigarettes, even understanding the health costs, shouldn't they be allowed to do that? Well, the problem with the free will argument is that it is predicated on the assumption that I am the only one who pays for my own bad decisions, and unfortunately nothing could be further from the truth. I bet a lot of you are thinking that I'm about to start talking about secondhand smoke. Well, you'd be wrong. Instead, I'm going to tell you a bit about epigenetics. What is epigenetics? Well, it's the study of the ways in which environmental factors shape our DNA. Every cell in your body contains an entire DNA strand, the blueprints to build every other cell in your body. So a relevant question becomes, how does each cell know which part of the strand it's supposed to read as a blueprint? Cells use chemical tags to denote which part of the strand they're supposed to work with. And environmental factors, like cigarette smoke, can disrupt these chemical tags. And this disruption can be passed on to our children. This is true even if we stop smoking well before conceiving a child. Smoking puts your future children at risk for a wide variety of health problems. This is a study from a team of researchers in Great Britain that studies the transgenerational effects of cigarette smoke. In it, they conclude the following. Cigarette smoke is one of the most prevalent and significant global chemical exposures. Recent work has suggested that some of the constituents of cigarette smoke, like other environmental toxins and factors, can induce harmful phenotypes in the descendants of exposed individuals. Pathway analysis therefore suggests that miRNA-mediated perturbation of cell death and apoptosis by cigarette smoke is an important mechanism of toxicity which may compromise sperm quality and/or early embryo development and lead to disorders such as reproductive defects in the descendants of smokers. Translation: If your parents smoked, you are at a higher risk of being infertile. And it doesn't stop there. A similar study from Great Britain examined the effects of smoking on the body mass index of children. They concluded the following. In the present study, we observed a transgenerational effect on a father's mid-childhood smoking on the BMI of his child at age 9. Now, this was expressed primarily in graphs, but what the conclusion was that men who started smoking at an earlier age went on to have children who were at a greater risk of obesity. The libertarian fallacy is a myth. We are all connected. When I make a bad decision, I am not the only one who suffers the consequences of that decision. These problems are well known, and the health risks of cigarette smoke are well known, and that doesn't change the fact that cigarette companies have been working to bury this information for decades. Philip Morris executives responded to corporate concerns about the possible adverse effects of secondhand smoke on maternal and child health by commissioning consultants to write review articles for population in the medical literature. PM executives successfully encouraged one author to change his original conclusion that secondhand smoke is an independent risk factor for sudden infant death syndrome to state that secondhand smoke was less well established. They're lying to us so that they can continue to sell us poison. And it's by no means limited to the cigarette companies. Exxon has known that fossil fuels play a contributing role in global warming for decades, and they have worked to bury that information. And if that's not enough, let's take a look at Wall Street, who knew perfectly well that a financial collapse was imminent and did nothing. Here's an article from Forbes in which they say the following. As one surveys the events of this sorry tale, it is tempting to consider it like a Shakespearean tragedy and wonder what would have happened if things had been different. What would have occurred if someone in a central bank or supervisory agency had blown the whistle on this emerging disaster? The answer is clear. Nothing. Nothing would have been different. This is not a speculation. We know it because an interesting new book describes what did happen to the people who did speak out and try to blow the whistle on what was going on. They were ignored or sidelined in the rush for money. So Wall Street knowingly tanked the global economy, causing suffering to untold millions of people just so they could have a better third quarter. The reality is that it is quite possible to make enormous sums of money through socially harmful behavior, but let's examine whether or not the converse is true. Is it possible to make no money whatsoever through socially beneficial behavior? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. In this study by Robert Leeton and Hal Singer of the Progressive Policy Institute, we study the effects of the broken patent system of the United States. In it, they conclude the following. Data indicates that unused patents represent a significant share of existing patents and a non-trivial share of research and development spending in the U.S. in recent decades. An estimated 95% of patented U.S. inventions fail to be licensed or commercialized, and 97% generate no royalties. Think about that for a moment. 95% of the inventions that we have created in the last few decades sit on shelves, used by no one. I would like to point out that even if some of these patents have no commercial value, they almost certainly have scientific or technological value. They could be used to further other scientific innovations. Unfortunately, investors can't access the knowledge in the patent database because of excessively high licensing fees. Some companies that can afford to pay these fees prey on inventors and entrepreneurs who cannot, and these are called patent trolls. What's a patent troll? A patent troll is a company that purchases a patent with no intention of developing the technology. Then they sue anyone who creates anything with even the most tenuous similarity to their product. Most companies and inventors opt to settle because they can't afford the cost of a protracted legal battle. It should be clear that unwarranted patent litigation provides obvious disincentives for innovation and investment in patent-related R&D. Few patent owners can afford to litigate patent disputes. Even those who can afford initial litigation face the prospect of losing in a court trial and may have to spend more to prevail on an appeal, a result that is also not guaranteed. These costs and risks prevent many viable patents from ever being licensed. Knowing this to be the case can even deter creators of new knowledge from filing patents in the first place, preferring to privately retain the knowledge as a trade secret. Yet for society as a whole, trade secrets are a poor substitute for patents, because the knowledge embodied in those secrets cannot be used by others to develop their innovations. Once again, what is best for the market is worst for the rest of us. A few things to consider. Number one, it's not the government that is preventing us from accessing patents. Rather, it is private industry that exploits the system for profit. Number two, what happens to the people who invented these patent technologies that are never used? What do we tell these people who dedicate their time and energy, their genius, to the advancements of scientific knowledge, only to see their inventions go unused? People who cannot profit at all from their hard work. Suppose that, like most geniuses, they're highly specialized and lack the skill set to thrive in a general 9-to-5 environment. What do we tell them? Conclusions. The bedrock assumptions of the free market are wrong. The system does not promote reciprocity. It is possible to make enormous sums of money by socially harmful actions. It is also possible to make no money whatsoever through socially beneficial actions. Welcome to the machine, my friends. Part 4. One size fits all. A new concept employed by biologists is that of a chronotype. People generally fall into one of two chronotypes, early risers called larks or late setters called owls, with some people able to shift between the two. It's important to understand that chronotype is biologically determined and cannot be changed through behavior. Here is a quote by a leading researcher in this field. The biological details, right down to the molecular and genetic levels, prove how much biology is behind our internal timing system. The last chapter demonstrated that one can find dedicated genes which are essential for the body clock to tick, and that their function within the clock appears to be the same across very different species, from insects to humans. That's from Dr. Till Ronenberg, who wrote a book called Internal Time. These results have been corroborated again and again and again. In a recent article for Live Science, Dr. Frederick Brown had the following to say. People span the range of those who are very early risers to very late setters, and this is genetically determined. To an extent, behavior and environment, say routinely pumping iron in a well-lit gym toward midnight, can shift our built-in predispositions. But those of us who are squarely in one chronotype camp or the other, for them the body is boss. If you're a morning type person, you can't become an evening type, and vice versa. In fact, it's been speculated that night owls and morning larks have completely different brain structures, with different advantages for each one. Morning people tend to be happier on average, whereas night owls such as myself tend to be more productive. Neither one is right or wrong. Rather, we are just different. However, the overwhelming evidence for a biological cause to circadian rhythms does not prevent Forbes from publishing articles like this. Early birds are made, not born. Here's how I did it. I'll spare you this man's story. Suffice it to say, his claim is that a slight change in his diet and his exercise regimen could turn him from a night person into a morning person. Here's the thing. I don't deny this man's experience. I believe him when he says this works for him. His mistake is believing that it will work for everyone else. In all likelihood, this man is what would be called a hummingbird, someone who can shift easily from lark to owl and back again. The situation is analogous to an ambidextrous man assuming that everyone can be equally proficient with his offhand. This is a cornerstone of corporate culture, positive thinking, and the reduction of all problems to positive thinking. Anyone can meet sales quotas if they just have the right attitude. Anyone can adapt to any situation if they just try hard enough. Biological limits, physical realities that certain people cannot overcome are anathema because they reinforce the idea that employees are people and not machines. Conformity is another major cornerstone of corporate culture. Why? It reinforces top-down hierarchies. It promotes mechanistic thinking. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, mechanistic thinking is something that you can see in the very language of corporate culture. I can't tell you how many cover letters I've written with the phrase, "I will be an asset to your organization." Employees are described as possessions. They perform repetitive, mechanistic tasks on a day-to-day basis. They are measured in terms of output and productivity. The Forbes article is a product of mechanistic thinking. Its flaw is the assumption that what worked for one person will work for all people. Humans must be thought of as interchangeable for the corporate machine to function, and this goes well beyond sleep schedule. Here's the tragic story of a woman who was fired for being transgender. Patricia Dawson was a successful electrician for many years. Unfortunately, she was assigned a male gender at birth, but in her heart, she always knew she was a woman. She began wearing skirts and blouses, growing out her hair, and taking hormone therapy. This is called transitioning, and for many individuals, it is a necessary step in the pursuit of their own happiness and well-being. Sadly, Patricia was fired for pursuing her own best interest, and she's not alone. Here's a study by Brad Sears and Christy Mallory of the Williams Institute of UCLA. In it, they conclude the following. As recently as 2011, 78% of respondents to the largest survey of transgender people to date reported experiencing at least one form of harassment or mistreatment at work because of their gender identity. More specifically, 47% had been discriminated in hiring, promotion, or job retention. Consistently, 70% of transgender respondents to a 2009 California survey and 67% of transgender respondents to a 2010 Utah survey reported experiencing employment discrimination because of their gender identity. Now, we are frequently encouraged to think of these injustices as problems stemming from regressive attitudes. Discrimination against transgender individuals might be seen as a symptom of a flawed and outdated concept of gender. Thus, activists in the social justice community work to change those attitudes. This, to me, is a noble goal, one that I believe we should all support. That said, however, I would like to pose a question that, to my knowledge, has not been raised elsewhere, at least not by any of the feminists or LGBT activists that I follow. Might corporate culture itself be part of the problem? Corporate culture values sameness. Corporate culture values uniformity, strict adherence to policy, and rigid top-down hierarchies. Employees are to be thought of as assets, as cogs in a well-oiled machine that all perform a specific function. One cornerstone of this mechanistic thinking is the concept of interchangeability. If the battery in my car fails, I simply replace it with another battery. Likewise, if an employee does not conform to my expectations, I simply fire her and replace her with someone else. Diversity movements, on the other hand, encourage us to think of people as unique individuals with their own specialized needs. For instance, if we were to accommodate a night owl's evening schedule or allow a transgender woman to retain employment during her transition, it would be a tacit recognition of their humanity. And we should recognize humanity. In case it's not abundantly clear, I am a strong supporter of the social justice movement. But here's the rub. Humans aren't interchangeable. You can't simply replace one human with another when he isn't living up to your expectations. True, you can always fire an underperforming employee, but the next person you bring in to fill that role will have his or her own set of special circumstances. Perhaps your next applicant is a single mother who has to leave the office every day at 5, no exceptions. Or perhaps he's a person with autism who needs a quiet, distraction-free environment to get anything done. Many people fight against diversity for this reason. It undermines the primacy of the corporate machine. So you have a movement that advocates diversity in the context of a culture that thrives on uniformity. Well, those two things do not mesh. Many of my friends in the social justice movement insist that the fight will never end, that we will always face racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry in one form or another. Perhaps they're right. I can't say for certain. Or perhaps we've been unable to exorcise these demons because we fail to address something that keeps them alive and well. Conclusions. The libertarian belief that the free market promotes individual liberty is a lie. In a free market, the needs of the individual will always be subordinate to the needs of the corporate hierarchy. A corporation is an abstraction, and yet it is granted the same rights as a real citizen. Meanwhile, flesh and blood human beings continually have their rights taken away. We've seen this multiple times throughout these two presentations. Elizabeth Taft, the young woman who was fired from Subway for getting the flu. Linda Altmont, the woman who was fired from JP Morgan Chase for trying to do the right thing and then harassed for it. Patricia Dawson, The woman who was fired for being a woman. Welcome to the machine. Part 5. All life is intrinsically valuable. I'd like to take a brief moment to tell you some of my own story. 10 years ago, I stood in this building, in this very room, as a teacher candidate. I got my teaching certificate and went on to teach in various private schools on short-term contracts for roughly 2 years. I left the profession for a variety of reasons. There were moral concerns, of course. I frequently found myself at odds with many of the policies and philosophies of the education system. But also there was a feeling of constantly being submerged underwater, of being drowned up to my head in things that I couldn't keep up with. The organizational demands upon a teacher, the time management, the paperwork, and the constant need to keep track of little things were very difficult for me to deal with. I realized that I didn't want to live my entire life feeling like I was out of breath, so I left the profession. I went on to work in a call center serving mutual fund accounts. Conditions there were harsh. The clients were abusive, the supervisors indifferent, and the environment caustic. We had a 90% turnover rate in 6 months. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you start your job in November, by May, 90% of the people who were there on the day you started wouldn't be there anymore. I was let go in 2009 due to budget cuts. From 2010 to 2012, I worked various office jobs, and I was fired multiple times for organizational deficits. I frequently lost track of important paperwork. I had a hard time completing various forms of paperwork. I tried my best, but I just couldn't keep up. During that time, my eyesight degenerated. I live with a condition called keratoconus, a condition where your cornea is warped and it affects your ability to see. I was undiagnosed for years, and as it progressed, I began to experience severe headaches, bouts of nausea, and extreme fits of exhaustion. By the end of 2012, I sank into a very deep depression. I honestly believed that I was useless. I was barely keeping up when I was healthy, barely able to hold down a job, and now I could barely get off the couch every day. I began to feel as though I was a drain on resources, and that the world might be a better place if I just wasn't in it. But here's the thing. I've been through a lot in my life, and suicide was never an option for me. So I realized that I had reached an impasse, a place where I had to change my conclusions. Essentially, I either had to off myself, or accept the fact that my life has intrinsic value regardless of how much money I make. During this time, I saw various neurologists, psychologists, and medical doctors who were trying to figure out what was wrong with me. My keratoconus had been, as of yet, undiagnosed. One of the neurologists informed me of something very interesting. Those organizational deficits I mentioned, they had a cause. Simply put, the part of my brain that would handle such tasks just didn't work right. And so I had a bit of a philosophical epiphany. An epiphany where I declared that all life, all human beings are intrinsically valuable. All of us have innate worth that cannot be denied. And we all have wonderful things that we can do to contribute to make other people's lives better. Not all of them fit nicely into a corporate structure. And thus we come to the moral paradox of capitalism. You have to contribute somehow to earn your access to resources through some form of labor, but opportunities to contribute are increasingly rare. Opportunities to contribute are limited to people with certain skill sets. Artists, philosophers, and activists are not deemed worthy of compensation. Most of them aren't in any sense. Why? Because those career paths challenge the status quo. And let's not forget the many inventors who can't capitalize on their inventions, the people I mentioned earlier. It gets even worse when you consider that the labor you do is often socially harmful. If you work for a tobacco company or an investment bank or an oil company, you're probably doing more harm than good. So we have a very serious question on our hands. Is it really a contribution if it hurts more people than it helps? When you get right down to it, the only moral imperative for denying anyone access to resources is scarcity. But scarcity is no longer a reality in our world. I won't try to prove that to you today. That is beyond the scope of this presentation. Suffice it to say, you can watch any of Peter Joseph's wonderful videos on this topic, and he will show you in thorough detail how big our capacity to create abundance truly is. No, my point here is simple. If you deny someone access to resources when there's more than enough to go around, it's murder. It's murder. As it stands, we currently produce enough food to feed 10 billion people, with roughly 30% of it going to waste. There are only 7 billion people on this planet, and 1 billion of them starve. Now, how does the math there make sense? Their blood is on our hands. We tell ourselves there's nothing we can do, but that is a convenient lie so that we can stomach the sight of ourselves when we look in the mirror. The fact of the matter is that the technological capacity to feed those people, to save them from that horrible death, exists, and we could employ it if we simply chose to work together, if we crawled out of our apathy for just a few moments. So here's the part where you make a choice. Do you want to be a man, or do you want to be a cog in a machine? Do you want to be a woman, or do you want to be a tool to be used for someone else's benefit? Do you want to be a human being, or do you want to be an asset? Make your choice, and be prepared to live with the consequences of that decision, because I can assure you, regardless of which way you choose, those consequences will be steep. We can improve this world, save these people if we choose to work together. So now I want you to look within yourselves and ask one question. Are you ready to be strong? Thank you and good night.